From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We're concerned about the potential for violence at multiple protests and rallies planned here in D.C. and at state capitol buildings around the country in the days to come that could bring armed individuals within close proximity to government buildings and officials.
The head of the FBI speaks publicly for the first time more than a week after the attack on the Capitol. From Washington, D.C. to state capitals across the country, authorities are bracing for more violence by armed right-wing extremists in the lead-up to the Biden-Harris inauguration. We'll speak to ProPublica's A.C. Thompson about last week's deadly insurrection, who did it, and what comes next.
The anti-government activists who invaded the Capitol have been out in the streets and at the state houses for the past year. And my concern looking forward is that this may not be the end, that we may see a real serious act of anti-government terrorism in the months ahead.
Then, as the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 approaches 400,000, we speak to Dr. Peter Salk. His father, Jonas Salk, developed the first polio vaccine.
Polio was an extreme problem back in the last century, paralyzing many children and causing great fear and anxiety. The vaccine that came along and the second vaccine have eliminated that disease entirely within this country. We have the potential with these new vaccines to have the same kind of experience of beginning to reduce and ultimately eliminate the threat of this pandemic that we're experiencing.
All that and more coming up. DemocracyNow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President-elect Joe Biden has proposed a massive $1.9 trillion plan to battle the coronavirus pandemic and the economic crisis. The plan calls for sending out an additional $1,400 per person in direct payments, $350 billion for hard-hit state and local governments, and another $400 billion in pandemic response funds to pay for vaccinations, testing, school reopenings, and emergency paid leave. It also offers enhanced employment benefits, tax credits to working families, rental assistance, and eviction and foreclosure moratoriums through September. Biden also called on Congress to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. He outlined his plan in a national address Thursday evening.
Some 18 million Americans are still relying on unemployment insurance. Some 400,000 small businesses have permanently closed their doors. The crisis of deep human suffering is in plain sight, and there's no time to waste. We have to act, and we have to act now.
Parts of Biden's plan rankled some progressive lawmakers like Cori Bush and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who pointed to Biden's proposal for $1,400 stimulus checks rather than the $2,000 checks many Democrats called for in recent weeks. Biden's transition team says the $1,400 checks would build on $600 payments already approved by Congress. Bloomberg's reporting Biden will seek a compromise deal that will mean a smaller initial package featuring some priorities favored by Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell. Meanwhile, new jobs data showed U.S. workers filed almost 1 million. That's 965,000 first-time claims for unemployment insurance last week, the highest level in 5 months and far above historical averages. This all comes as the U.S. reported its 10th day in a row of more than 200,000 new coronavirus cases Thursday and over 3,700 COVID-19 deaths in the United States. The total confirmed number of deaths is set to top 400,000 before Inauguration Day. That's next Wednesday. Dozens of people on an FBI terrorist watch list were in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, when President Trump incited a violent mob of white supremacist insurrectionists to attack the Capitol. That's according to the Washington Post, which reports most of the rioters flagged by the National Terrorist Screening Database are white supremacists. The FBI says more than 100 insurrectionists have been arrested so far, with more than 200 other other suspects identified. Among the latest arrests, Kevin Seafried, who was photographed carrying a Confederate battle flag through the halls of Congress, former U.S. Olympic swimming medalist Clete Keller, who wore his Olympic swim team jacket to the riots, and Robert Sanford, a retired firefighter who was filmed throwing a fire extinguisher at Capitol Police officers, striking 3 of them in the head. In Arizona, the lawyer for rioter Jacob Anthony Chansley said he'll seek a pardon from President Trump. Chansley faces charges of violent entry and disorderly conduct after he was filmed posing shirtless, wearing buffalo horns, and holding a spear on the Senate dais. In a court filing unveiled Thursday, federal prosecutors in Phoenix wrote Chansley left a note for Vice President Mike Pence reading, "It's only a matter of time. Justice is coming." They added, quote, strong evidence, including Chansley's own words and actions at the Capitol, supports that the intent of the Capitol rioters was to capture and assassinate elected officials in the United States government, unquote. Video from January 6 posted to the now-defunct social media site Parler shows Chansley boasting about his role in the insurrection.
How did you get out?
How did I get what?
How did you get out?
Of the Senate?
Yeah.
Cops walked out with me.
They just let you go?
Yeah.
What's your message to everybody now? Like, what are you yelling at?
Donald Trump asked everybody to go home. He just put out a tweet. It's a minute long. He asked everybody to go home.
Why do you think so?
Because, dude, we won the day.
The Washington Post reports the National Park Service will close the National Mall on Inauguration Day amidst fears of domestic terror attacks. Michigan Congressmember Peter Meyer said Thursday he purchased a bulletproof vest and will have the expense reimbursed by Congress after he joined 9 other Republicans and House Democrats voting for Trump's impeachment on Wednesday. Democratic New York Congressmember Adriano Espaillat announced he's tested positive for the coronavirus and is asymptomatic. Espaillat received the 2nd dose of his COVID-19 vaccine last week. It takes several weeks to build up immunity after the shots, which have been proved to prevent severe disease but are not known to prevent people from becoming infected or spreading the virus to others. Over 93 million cases of COVID-19 have now been reported around the world, with confirmed global deaths set to top 2 million. An analysis by the Wall Street Journal finds at least another 820,000 deaths on top of that number were caused by the coronavirus. In Brazil, officials in Amazonas, the country's largest state, have imposed a 7 p.m. curfew, and health workers say they're desperate for oxygen supplies and other resources as they face a dramatic surge. Hospitals in the state's capital, Manaus, are resorting to performing manual ventilation to try to save people's lives. A local epidemiologist called the situation an unprecedented calamity. Officials say a new variant could be partially to blame for the explosion in cases. Britain's banning travel from much of South America, as well as Portugal, over fears of the variant. Brazil's recorded over 207,000 deaths, the 2nd highest tally after the United States. In climate news, 2020 edged out 2016 as the hottest year ever recorded, with global surface temperatures averaging 2.25 degrees Fahrenheit above historical averages, or 1.2 degrees Celsius. The 7 last years have been the warmest years ever observed. The worsening climate crisis brought record heat waves and fires, searing droughts in the busiest Atlantic hurricane season on record. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels surpassed 410 parts per million in 2020, also a record, continuing an inexorable rise. The dire climate report comes even as the coronavirus pandemic slowed the worldwide pace of emissions in 2020, with U.S. greenhouse gas emissions dropping by 10%. In Yemen, aid groups are sounding the alarm following the U.S. move to designate Houthi rebels as a terrorist group. The UN is warning of, quote, famine not seen in 40 years. Houthis control Yemen's capital, Sana'a, running financial institutions and coordinating with international groups that supply food and other essentials to the area. Yemenis also rely heavily on remittances, which have already fallen during the pandemic and which could now be further disrupted.
My family and I depend for a big part on expatriates for our livelihood. I have relatives in Saudi Arabia, the U.S., and in other countries. I depend on them for my expenses. If the decision is enacted, it will hit remittances, and my family's situation will deteriorate. The decision works against us, and the private sector is in danger. Work can stop at any moment.
Back in the United States, former Michigan Governor Rick Snyder and 8 other former officials were charged Thursday in a sweeping criminal investigation into the Flint water crisis. Snyder faces 2 charges of willful neglect of duty, a misdemeanor. Snyder's former health director, Nick Lyon, faces 9 felony counts of involuntary manslaughter. In 2014, Flint's unelected emergency manager appointed by then-Governor Snyder switched Flint's water supply to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The move has been linked to at least 12 deaths from an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease and widespread lead poisoning in residents, including children, in the majority black city. Michigan's Solicitor General, Fadwa Hammond, spoke on Thursday.
At this very moment, the people of Flint continue to suffer from the categorical failure of public officials at all levels of government, who trampled upon their trust and evaded accountability for far too long. There are no velvet ropes in our criminal justice system. Nobody, no matter how powerful or well-connected, is above accountability when they commit a crime.
To see our documentary, Thirsty for Democracy, The Poisoning of an American City, you can go to democracynow.org. In immigration news, a damning new report by the Justice Department's Inspector General directly implicates President Trump in aggressively pushing for harsher, crueler immigration policies, despite knowing they would lead to the separation of thousands of asylum-seeking families. According to the report, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions said in a 2018 meeting, quote, "We need to take the children away," and that there was tremendous pressure from Trump to prosecute more asylum seekers. The report also says Trump and senior officials were woefully unprepared to enforce the zero-tolerance policy. In response, ACLU attorney Lee Gallant said, quote, "The barbaric family separation practice was immoral and illegal. This new report shows just how far the Trump administration was willing to go to destroy these families," Gallant said. In related news, ICE's newest acting director, Jonathan Fahey, has stepped down after 2 weeks on the job. Fahey is the latest Homeland Security official to resign just days before President Trump leaves office. Acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf resigned earlier this week. A caravan of hundreds of asylum seekers from Central America is expected to depart Honduras today with the hopes of reaching the United States. The caravan's likely to face obstacles as it tries to cross through the region and into Mexico. Reuters reports just a week ago, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexico issued a joint declaration that would require asylum seekers produce a negative COVID-19 test at border checkpoints. Tens of thousands of Central Americans were displaced after 2 back-to-back hurricanes battered the region last November. The pandemic also worsened an already devastating economic crisis in Central America. In more U.S. immigration news, a report by Physicians for Human Rights and Harvard Medical School highlights how Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, failed to implement even the most basic hygienic methods to prevent the spread of the coronavirus inside immigration jails. The report says prisoners did not have access to soap to wash their hands, were not able to socially distance inside the squalid jails. If prisoners raised safety concerns, they would be retaliated against, according to the report. Researchers spoke to 50 formerly incarcerated immigrants. A 33-year-old man who was held at Otay Mesa Detention Center in California said, quote, "I think I got COVID because I had body pain and felt short of breath, but I never said anything to anybody because I was so scared that they were going to punish me," he said. New York Attorney General Letitia James has sued the New York Police Department, accusing police officers of widespread abuses against peaceful racial justice protesters last year. This is the first time in history a state attorney general has sued a police department. This is Letitia James speaking at a news conference Thursday.
We found that over the course of the protests from May to December of 2020, NYPD officers engaged in blatant use of excessive force and often misconduct, including the indiscriminate, unjustified, and repeated use of batons, pepper spray, bicycles, and a crowd-controlled tactic known as kettling, also referred to as containment, which caused significant physical harm. We also found that NYPD officers unlawfully detained and arrested legal observers, medics, and other essential workers performing services.
This comes as new data show police are 3 times more likely to use force against leftist and progressive protesters than right-wing rioters. And the Academy Award-winning filmmaker and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Laura Poitras published an open letter Thursday saying she'd been fired in November from her job at First Look Media, where she co-founded The Intercept with Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill. She wrote, quote, "My termination came 2 months after I spoke to the press about The Intercept's failure to protect whistleblower Reality Winner and the cover-up and lack of accountability that followed," unquote. Winner is a former National Security Agency linguist who's now serving a 5-year prison sentence for leaking documents to The Intercept about Russian meddling in the 2016 elections. First Look disputed Poitras' account, saying her contract was not renewed because, quote, "she has not been active in any capacity with our company for more than 2 years," unquote. This comes as Reality Winner's mother is leading a campaign to push President Trump or President-elect Joe Biden to pardon her. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, from Washington, D.C. to state capitals across the country, authorities are bracing for more violence by armed right-wing extremists. We'll speak to ProPublica's A.C. Thompson about last week's deadly insurrection at the Capitol. Who did it? What comes next? Stay with us. He'd send in the army by Gang of Four. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Security's being ramped up in Washington, D.C. and state capitals across the United States as the FBI's warning of more potential armed protests in the lead-up to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's inauguration, following last week's deadly insurrection at the Capitol. By Wednesday, 21,000 National Guard troops are expected to be in Washington, D.C. FBI Director Christopher Wray spoke publicly for the first time more than a week after the insurrection Thursday.
We're concerned about the potential for violence at multiple protests and rallies planned here in D.C. and at state capitol buildings around the country in the days to come that could bring armed individuals within close proximity to government buildings and officials.
Federal authorities have arrested over 100 people who took part in last week's deadly insurrection at the Capitol that left 6 people dead. Police and federal agents continue to round up rioters Thursday. That's 5 people dead. Among the latest arrests, Kevin Seafried, who was photographed carrying a Confederate battle flag through the Capitol, former U.S. Olympic medalist Clete Keller, who wore his Olympic swim team jacket to the riots, Robert Sanford, a retired firefighter who was filmed throwing a fire extinguisher at Capitol police officers, striking 3 of them in the head, and Peter Stager, an Arkansas man filmed beating a police officer at the Capitol with an American flag. In Arizona, prosecutors say they've uncovered evidence that the intent of some of the rioters was to, quote, capture and assassinate elected officials in the U.S. government. Prosecutors revealed the QAnon conspiracy theorist, Jacob Chansley, who's also known as Jake Angeli, left a note from Mike Pence in the Senate warning, quote, it's only a matter of time, justice is coming. Chansley faces charges of violent entry and disorderly conduct after he was filmed posing shirtless, wearing buffalo horns and holding a spear on the Senate dais. And in Texas, a federal prosecutor has revealed more details about its case against retired Air Force officer Larry Brock, who was seen inside the Capitol dressed in military gear holding zip ties. Prosecutors claim that Brock was prepared to take hostages and, quote, perhaps execute members of the U.S. government. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports dozens of people on a terrorist watch list, mostly white supremacists, were in Washington on the day of the insurrection. We go now to A.C. Thompson, staff reporter with ProPublica, who's covered the rise of the right-wing extremist and white supremacist groups for years. His latest piece headlined, Members of Several Well-Known Hate Groups Identified at Capitol Riot. He's joining us from Lansing, Michigan. A.C., thanks so much for coming back to Democracy Now! Can you start off by responding to what happened last week in Washington, D.C.? Did it surprise you, this mass insurrection, after President Trump had for weeks been calling for this protest and addressed them before they marched to the Capitol? And who was behind it?
One of our contacts in the far-right movement said to us, hey, I think this is going to go in a very extreme direction. And in fact, I'm not going to mobilize my people to participate because I think it's going to be very violent. And that was a signal to us that this was going to be quite extreme. We had seen this building over the past year, though. If you go back to January 2020 in Richmond, Virginia, 20,000 armed people showed up at the State House there. In the spring, there were protests that were armed in Michigan at the State House, including one in which people stormed the building and intimidated legislators with weapons, with AR-15 assault rifles. We saw the Idaho State House get stormed. We saw the Oregon State House get stormed. We saw in Olympia, Washington, by the Capitol there were shootings in the street 2 weeks in a row. 2 people were shot, 1 each week. And so this had been building for a long time. I personally was at an armed rally at the Virginia State House a couple months ago, where about 50 men with weapons showed up and basically dared the police to arrest them because they were in violation of the law. So this was something that had been coming for a long time. And if you looked at the rhetoric online and you looked at what had been said by members of these groups for a long time, it was all about revolution. It was all about death to tyrants. It was all about civil war for a long time. On the day of the event, we saw militia groups like the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, who were playing a big role. We saw the conspiracy theorists like the QAnon people who were there. We saw, I think, a significant role played by the Proud Boys, who you could call an ultra-nationalist street fighting gang or group. And I think we saw a lot of military vets and some current military there. And there were also people who belonged to straight up white supremacist or white nationalist groups.
You mentioned Virginia. We reported earlier this week that 2 of the rioters were off-duty Virginia police. And this goes to the issue of police and military from all over the country. You know, people were saying, where were the police? Well, they were part of the riot, the insurrection, a number of them. You have police from Seattle, apparently New York, Philadelphia transit officers, a number of them, 2 Virginia officers. Now, this is just people who were identified. Can you talk about this? A PSYOPs guy, military psychological operations. Can you talk about the significance of this?
You know, I think there's a big concern that what we've seen in recent years is a lot of members of police departments, or at least some members of police departments, being radicalized in this right-wing direction. And in part, I think what that's been a product of is they've seen the rise of the racial justice movements and police accountability movements, and they say, I feel under attack. The person who's sticking up for us is Donald Trump, who's super law and order. And so I'm going to get deep into the Donald Trump world. And I think that's part of what's happened. What's happening now, though, is different. And what's happening now is when I was in D.C. at Stop the Steal protests and other protests in recent months, you would see the right-wing protesters did not want to fight with the police. They would say, we're the law and order people. We're the pro-police people. We're not going to fight with the police. We want to fight with the police, but we're going to back off. That has changed. That has pivoted. And now what you're seeing in the chatter amongst the right-wing groups is we are at war with the police. The police are in bed with the Reds. The police are a tool of this socialist takeover, which we believe magically is happening without any facts. We believe that the police are subverting democracy, and we are now going after the police. And that's what you saw at the Capitol. So let's talk about the lack of preparation at the Capitol. You see these police officers, the Capitol Police, some helped by the Metropolitan Police, fending for themselves. And we got the reports this week of the level of threat assessment reports that would come before each Black Lives Matter protest. Nothing like that was issued now. And yet you have this coming together of all of these people from, and if you can explain what the terrorist watch list is, it's not a no-fly list. And for many progressives, they may be very concerned about who makes up this list. But the fact is, scores of people on the FBI's own list had gathered, and yet the FBI issued no reports, and there was so little preparation. We saw African-American Capitol Police essentially running for their lives, saying they didn't have the support from the top, and they were being chased by the mob. Right. So there's a few things that I want to touch on here. And a few years ago, you and I were talking about Charlottesville, and what we had seen there was an intelligence breakdown where really the intelligence analysts and the law enforcement personnel who should have really been monitoring the online channels and the chatter missed what was going on and what was going to develop. And then you saw multiple law enforcement agencies who were supposed to be there coordinating, working together, who really didn't have a plan, and cooperation totally broke down. And when violence and rioting broke out, the people with the tactical gear, with the shields, with the helmets, with the riot gear were nowhere near the violence. You saw a lot of that happen at the Capitol, a lot of the same things happening over again years later, with basically some of the same people showing up at both events. This is what's baffling to me. The FBI has gotten very good in recent years at tracking and arresting and building cases against right-wing extremists, white supremacist extremists, anti-government extremists. In the run-up to the election, they built a lot of very complicated, important cases against people who were bent on violence against public officials, the kidnapping plot against Gretchen Whitmer, the governor in Michigan. They were very, very busy. And what I don't understand is how that knowledge from the field agents out in the field doesn't seem to have translated, as far as we can tell at this point, into intelligence products that would have gone out and been disseminated more broadly to other law enforcement agencies. That's a thing. Another thing is just simply the lack of personnel and the lack of preparation by the Capitol Police on the day of the event. I've been watching the DC Metropolitan Police for months now, and I think that they've been very professional, very sophisticated in allowing protesters at these right-wing events in DC to express themselves, but not to harm people and not for violence to break out. That is clearly not the case with the Capitol Police. They did not evince that level of professionalism and sophistication.
The Washington Post reported earlier this week the FBI explicitly warned of violence and war at the U.S. Capitol, an internal report issued one day before last Wednesday's deadly invasion. The report cited online posts, including one which said, quote, Congress needs to hear glass breaking, doors being kicked in, blood from their BLM and Pantifa slave soldiers being spilled. Get violent. Stop calling this a march or a rally or a protest. Go there ready for war. We get our president or we die. So, A.C. Thompson, I mean, how much more explicit can you get? And, I mean, we're not only talking about let's do a postmortem on last week's event, and postmortem is the right word. I mean, you're talking about a number of people dead. 2 police officers, the Capitol Hill police officer, Sicknick, who died, and then one who took his own life. And then you have 3 people who died in medical emergencies, apparently. But we're not only talking about the past. We're talking about whether this is prologue to this weekend. I mean, Monday is Dr. Martin Luther King's federal birthday, which is official. His birthday was today. But for years, white supremacists marched on state capitals to prevent it from being recognized as a national holiday. And then, of course, Wednesday, the inauguration.
Yeah, I don't want to be alarmist, and I don't want to be the person who says the sky is falling, but I do think we have to be vigilant. I think we have to be looking forward. I think we have to be very, very careful in the months ahead. And this is why. We were out on the campaign trail filming for Frontline at Trump rallies and at Trump speeches. And when we'd meet people, they would all say the only way the president is going to lose the election is if there's massive fraud, and it'll be probably massive fraud orchestrated by those nefarious globalists. There are millions of people who believe, because of Trump's incessant false messaging, that the election was fraudulent, that the election was stolen from him. And if you have just a very small percentage of those millions of people who are inclined to take violent action because they believe that we are on the cusp of a massively undemocratic transition of power built around fraud, of course, some of those people are likely to take very violent action to save in their minds to save this republic. And that is the thing we must be concerned about. In America, it does not take very much money and very much skill to create a mass casualty event with a bomb or a gun. And that is the thing we're going to have to be very vigilant about, while at the same time ensuring that people have a right to protest, that people have a right to express themselves.
I'm wondering if you can talk about the alliances between all of these groups and current sitting members of Congress. You've got Utah Republican Congressmember John Curtis, who showed reporters a death threat left on his door on Thursday, a poster with skulls and crossbones pasted over his eyes and the caption, "Wanted for treason for resisting the true electoral victor Trump." Now, here is a congressman who, of course, was voicing concern about, the fact that Republicans were not accepting the election of Joe Biden. But you've got other ones who led the charge about doing this. Can you talk about whether the Congress members and what should happen to them now? Even in President Trump's latest video, he will not acknowledge this election of Joe Biden. And does it actually encourage the violence, the fact that he's not showing up for the inauguration? Many may be deeply relieved that Trump won't be there. But does that send a message it's okay to target?
I think there's a couple things going on here. And the first thing is that we have not acknowledged the scale of threats, intimidation, and violence against public leaders that's occurred over the past year. We have so many public health officials in this country at county and state levels who have been threatened, at federal levels as well, been threatened, who have been terrorized, who have had to get extra security, who have been doing their jobs and are in fear for their lives. And we basically, as a society, have not grappled with that. Now we've got elections officials, Republican and Democrat, who are dealing with that. We've got members of Congress who are dealing with that. We've got law enforcement leaders who are dealing with that. In California, we had two law enforcement officials who were shot by an extremist group allegedly during the spring. Somebody's now facing federal charges for that. So I think there's been the Boogaloo Boys, exactly. So I think there's been a level of violence and aggression towards public officials and government leaders that we have not seen in decades. And I don't think we've reckoned with that at all. It's a scary time to be a public leader. Now, when you're talking about Congress, this is a thing that we're going to have to understand deeply, and we're going to need serious investigations about what was the role of sympathetic members of Congress in possibly fomenting or even enabling this insurrection, because I don't think we've gotten to the bottom of that. We've heard names thrown out as potential members of Congress from Arizona and Alabama who may have aided and abetted these groups, but we don't know yet. I think that's a very concerning thing as well.
I mean, you have Mikey Sherrill, right, the New Jersey Congress member who said they called the Sergeant of Arms the day before saying, what are all these tour groups they now recognize were the people who were part of this insurrection being taken around? I mean, COVID times, they're not doing tours there. So they could only get in through a Congress member or their staff.
Exactly. And that is a big concern. I'll tell you, from interviewing members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, they said to us, we had a Democratic congressman say to us, I'm worried that we have empathizers and sympathizers within the ranks of the Capitol Police. That was Rep. Andre Carson from the Indianapolis area. We had a GOP congresswoman, Nancy Mace, who said, look, I could tell days before this happened that it was going to be ugly because I was getting relentless threats online and through all different channels. And I'm a Trump supporter, but I had said I'm not going to try to overturn this election. And so then I was the one targeted, and it doesn't sound like she got a lot of help with that. She sent her children home to South Carolina because she was scared for their lives. We have not, even begun to grapple with how serious this problem is.
If you could very quickly, we only have a minute to go, but you detail in your pieces, and you just talked about the 3%ers, the Oath Keepers, Boogaloo Boys, Proud Boys. Tell us who some of these people are. Many people haven't even heard of these groups before.
Right. So the Boogaloo Boys are an anti-government group who joined the Capitol insurrection, who've been tied to murderers, kidnapping plots, and the rest. The Proud Boys are an ultra-nationalist street gang or street fighting group that have been at many of these events and probably seem to have been a key player here. The Oath Keepers and the 3%ers are militia groups that sort of are traditional, long-time anti-government groups. And QAnon is the conspiracy theory followers who believe that there's a vast cabal of globalists and Satanists who are trying to take over America.
And finally, you have Ali Alexander, and this from the Washington Post, who organized the so-called Stop the Steal movement, who said he hatched the plan for this insurrection, with the support of the 3 Republican lawmakers, you alluded to them, but Congress members Andy Biggs of Arizona, Mo Brooks of Alabama, Paul Gosar of Arizona, all hardline Trump supporters.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's going to be a really key investigative point there. And honestly, like looking at Mr. Alexander and how he raised money and what his role in all this was as well is going to be a key thing to look at.
A.C. Thompson, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Keep up your great investigation. Staff reporter with ProPublica, who's covered the rise of right-wing extremist and white supremacist groups for years. We'll link to your latest piece, Members of Several Well-Known Hate Groups Identified at Capitol Riot. Next up, as the U.S. death toll for COVID-19 approaches 400,000, we'll speak with Dr. Peter Salk, his father, Dr. Jonas Salk. He first developed the first polio vaccine. Stay with us.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be.
I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. The great late Nina Simone. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States reported its 10th day in a row of more than 200,000 new COVID-19 cases Thursday and over 3,700 deaths. The total confirmed number of deaths is set to top 400,000 before Inauguration Day, which is next Wednesday. Meanwhile, the U.S. rollout of the coronavirus vaccine continues to lag even as states follow new CDC recommendations to offer the vaccine to anyone 65 and older. Fewer than 10 million people in the U.S. have received at least one dose of the coronavirus vaccine, despite the federal government's aim to have 20 million people vaccinated by the end of 2020. As efforts to ramp up distribution continue, we look back at another epidemic that swept the globe and how a vaccine changed everything. It was the 1950s when polio hit a fever pitch, disabling an average of 35,000 people a year until pioneering Dr. Jonas Salk made history by developing an effective polio vaccine. The story of Jonas Salk is told in the documentary The Shot Felt Round the World, how the polio vaccine saved millions. This is the trailer.
When we look back upon polio today, you look back upon what was really a summer plague. It came every year. It came like locusts. There was no prevention. There was no cure. There was no protection.
I grew up in a family where there was a sense, that my dad was a scientist. He actually would talk about how he used to, as a child, pray that he could do something good for humanity.
He was the miracle worker in the white coat on the one hand, but he was also an incredibly hard-working, devoted scientist for whom people were willing to sacrifice.
He was challenging medical orthodoxy.
All of the people who mattered in virology, John Enders, Albert Sabin, Tom Rivers, and others, basically believed in a live virus vaccine. And here is Jonas Salk, someone who was younger, going in exactly the opposite direction.
He was well aware of the early vaccine failures. The first attempt with an inactivated polio vaccine killed kids.
It's a testament to his courage and resolve that he could inoculate children with something that he knew started out as live, dangerous poliovirus.
The stakes couldn't be higher. Vaccines are always always a matter of risk versus reward, and nothing is perfect. Nothing is perfect.
We didn't have to really be stimulated very much because up on the third floor was the polio ward where they had all the iron lungs.
And I remember the faces on some of these kids, in agony. Just picture your own 2-year-old. It's just dreadful.
The vaccination was 80 to 90% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
The guy gets off the elevator. He never got into the room. It works, they were yelling.
There were newspaper reporters that ran to telephones to quickly get this as a front page headline on probably every newspaper in this country.
Kids ran out into the street, factory whistles went off, church bells tolled. It was in a way as if a war had ended. Jonas Salk became a national hero. He was on the cover of Time. Newsweek called him one of the greatest Americans. President Eisenhower invited him to the White House and actually broke down. This is a sign of how great American medicine is at this time. It is an extraordinarily wonderful, optimistic moment, okay? And there is reason to be proud. Jonas Salk is the people's scientist.
That's the trailer for the shot felt round the world, the remarkable story of Dr. Jonas Salk. And this is the famous journalist Edward Murrow asking Dr. Jonas Salk in 1955, who owns the patent to the polio vaccine?
Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
Could you patent the sun? For more on this history and why it's relevant today, we're joined by the son of Dr. Jonas Salk. That's right, physician Dr. Peter Salk. He's a professor of infectious disease and microbiology at the University of Pittsburgh, was just 9 years old in 1953 when his dad came home and injected him with the polio vaccine. He recently wrote an op-ed for the Globe and Mail headlined, "Polio Vaccines Brought an Earlier Epidemic Under Control. New Vaccines Can End This Current Plague." Dr. Salk is joining us from La Jolla, California. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us with an astounding story about how your father changed the world. But talk about you as a little boy. I mean, we're talking 2 years before this was accepted. Your dad comes home and you were, 9 years old?
Yeah, indeed. Well, he came home with the experimental vaccine that had been tested in a small group of kids, starting out with kids who already had polio, as a protective measure, and was just at the point of wanting to expand these trials in the Pittsburgh area in lead up to what became this huge national field trial that started in 1954 with 1.8 million school children taking part. So this was a transition moment. Came home with a vaccine, came home with glass syringes, which is what were used at the time, and reusable needles that he had to boil on the stove in order to sterilize. Lined us 3 kids up. I was the oldest and my 2 younger brothers, and administered the injections. And none of us liked needles. They were one of our least favorite things. And I might not even remember that occasion, except for the fact that for some miracle that morning, the injection didn't hurt. And that emblazoned the memory in my mind, so I can see myself standing in the kitchen, see the light coming in the window. It's something I won't forget.
So,
you know what? Let me add something. I want to add this just about that particular pivotal moment. What I think my father was doing in preparation for rolling out to larger number of kids in the Pittsburgh area is, number one, demonstrating his confidence in this experimental vaccine preparation. The second thing was, okay, we've seen the results in these very small trials that have been done, that the vaccine, the experimental vaccine, is increasing antibody levels, which should be enough to protect against paralysis. I want my kids protected.
So talk about, he was upending the science of much more established scientists. Talk about what he came up with, the idea of the live virus being injected versus other means.
Yeah, when he was in medical school, a professor told the class that you can use inactivated material to protect against some bacterial diseases, but when it comes to viral diseases, you can't do that. You need to have an actual infection with a live virus in order to produce protective immunity. And my father just couldn't understand why should that be the case. And he asked the professor why, and the professor said, well, because. And that set my father off on the trajectory that characterized this next phase of his career. He ended up doing some work with a person who had been one of his teachers in medical school, went to join him at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. You saw him for a moment in the trailer. This was Thomas Francis, who ended up being responsible for analyzing the results of this huge national field trial with the polio vaccine. But leading up before that, my father worked with Dr. Francis on the very first influenza vaccine, indeed using a killed virus or an inactivated virus, contrary to the way people thought things should be done, and that worked. It was introduced into the armed forces at the end of World War II, and following that, my father brought the family to Pittsburgh, to the University of Pittsburgh, where he was going to continue that sort of work. He got tapped on the shoulder by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the March of Dimes, to take part in some initial studies in preparation for vaccine work, and very quickly just decided to get on this horse and run, so to speak, and move towards getting an inactivated poliovirus vaccine out and available.
So compare that, Dr. Salk. It's so interesting to call you, obviously your name is Dr. Salk, but it's Dr. Peter Salk. Because compare that to the vaccines of today, what the mRNA is compared to the polio vaccine.
No, this is really so extraordinary because back in those days, there were only fundamentally two approaches to making vaccines against viral illnesses: the killed virus, whole virus, inactivated so that it can't do harm, but it has all of the materials of the virus that will stimulate the immune system to produce antibodies and so on. The other approach was a live virus, living, that had been weakened in the laboratory or in passage through animals so that it would cause an infection but not produce deleterious effects. So that's all that was available back then. Now, since then, there's been so much that has been learned about how viruses work, their makeup, their genetics, how they infect people, and so on. And what we have today is just an explosion of new techniques to make vaccines very quickly. So these two mRNA vaccines that have come out are making use of one of those techniques, which is to take the genetic material of the coronavirus and focus on just that part of the genetic of the genome that codes for the so-called spike protein that many people have heard about that's on the surface of the virus, and that's the protein that the virus uses to get inside of cells. So it's been constructed in just the right way, and what's been done with those two vaccines is just take that pure DNA, encapsulate it, inject it into the muscle, it gets into the cells, and that RNA instructs the cells that RNA gets into to manufacture the spike protein. Doesn't manufacture anything else about the virus. There's no coronavirus that's produced. It's just this pure protein that then the immune system sees and recognizes, hey, that's something new. I don't like it. And the body makes antibodies against it. And it's those antibodies then that end up being protective against developing severe coronavirus vaccine, because when the virus comes into the body, the real actual virus, those antibodies are all tooled up to fight against it. So that's one approach. Another kind of approach that's available now to make a vaccine very quickly is taking the genetic instructions and putting them into a different kind of virus that's harmless, like a common cold virus, the so-called adenovirus. And that virus then can get into the body, transmit the genetic instructions, and then the same thing happens. The body makes the right kind of antibodies. You can put that even into a measles vaccine virus as another that's harmless. That's another kind of approach.
I wanted to go to Noam Chomsky for a minute. We talked to him last year about your father, Jonas Salk.
old enough to remember the terror of polio was ended by a government-initiated, funded project that finally led to the Salk vaccine, which was free, no intellectual property rights. Jonas Salk said it should be as free as the sun.
And I want to repeat that one more time, though we've played it a few times on the show here. When journalist Ed Murrow asked your dad, Dr. Jonas Salk, who owned the patent to the polio vaccine, Salk replied, well, the people. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? This is the SOT.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?
So this is such a profound point and so different from the way medicine is practiced today. The significance of who profits from these vaccines, Dr. Salk.
Well, we're living in a real world, and the real world is made up, includes businesses that need to be able to make investments in the research that they're doing and to make profits on that basis. What I think is so important at this juncture is the world is needing vaccines. We've been focused on our own situation now, and that's appropriate, but the rest of the world and the countries that are less able to afford vaccines need consideration as well. So somehow there needs to be a creative cooperation among all of us, including the businesses, in order to find ways to satisfy the needs of these other countries that can't afford the kinds of interventions that we have been able to afford
ourselves. The World Health Organization just said 46 countries are now vaccinating their populations.
That's good.
Only one of those 46 is a low-income country.
That's not good.
So, Dr. Salk, I want to ask about the studies. Now, under 10 million people have been vaccinated in the United States. But the movement of those who are deeply concerned about a vaccine, that it could make you sick, are saying, okay, where is the evidence? Where are the studies of the effects of these vaccines? The fact that, one, we don't have a national database so people can report on, what they feel afterwards and what's happened to them, but also just who has gotten this vaccine, who is getting two vaccines, how do you ensure that you get the second vaccine? Now with President-elect Biden saying and the Trump administration agreeing, just release all the vaccines so people will just see if they get the second vaccine. That makes you more fully immune.
There are a bunch of different questions sort of embedded in that, and I'm of mixed mind. I have to say, thinking for myself, I've not yet received the vaccine. I'm very much looking forward to it. I had been concerned initially about the prospect that this was being rushed too fast, but I'm not feeling that way now. I'm feeling very good about what I've seen from the studies that were done. The vaccine, these two first vaccines, around 95% effective. That is extraordinary. And with some soreness of the arm, maybe feeling a bit punk, on occasion, people who have a tendency towards allergic reactions can develop an allergic reaction. You have to be watched for 30 minutes after the injection to be sure that anything that comes along can be treated. We've not seen anything substantial so far with these two vaccines that would suggest more serious effects being exerted. But yes, of course, we have to keep a very careful eye as the numbers increase to be sure that there's not something that comes along that is rare but unexpected and that needs to be taken into account.
Children have not been tested at this point. Is that right? Kids under 14.
That's correct. That's correct.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but we're not going to let you off the hook. We're having you back on. Do you think it's possible for people in this country, for, as Joe Biden says, 100 million people to be vaccinated in the first 100 days of his administration?
I think that's stretching it, frankly. It would be wonderful if so. I really would prefer to get if I get a first shot, I'd prefer to get a second shot because that's where the 95% effectiveness lies. But at this point, I think anything that's going to get this process accelerated will be a good thing.
Dr. Peter Salk, his father, Dr. Jonas Salk, developed the first polio vaccine. We thank you so much for being with us. Now a professor of infectious disease and microbiology at University of Pittsburgh. We'll link to your piece. I'm Amy Goodman. Wear a mask. It's an act of love.